Greetings, Frans. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. It's good to see you again. It's a long time ago.
Yeah, it's
There
good to
is
see you.
there is a message here that says this meeting is being recorded. That's very
It
good.
is. Yeah. We're recording this so we can share it with the Anna audience and all those interested in all the work you're doing behind the scenes, editing a large chunk of what we know as argument and argumentation.
Sure. And I heard from the Springer people who are the publisher of Argumentation that they're also interested in knowing where this gets published because they want to see it too.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. The last time we did this, it was quite a success. And a lot of people, it was the most watched video. So
Mhm.
I guess let's get to that first question I have for you today, which is how did you decide to become an editor and why?
Yeah, the idea was that Rob Grotendorst and I, we were always working together in those days in the 80s, that we wanted to establish argumentation theory as a real discipline. And we did not know in the beginning, earlier than that there were also other people working on argumentation, like the informal logic people and people in communication in the United States. So we were just working in Amsterdam, and we thought it would be so good if we could establish a discipline. And as part of that, we were thinking of what do you need in order to develop a discipline? All kinds of things, let me not go into that. But one thing that was for sure was that you should have also journals and conferences and things like that. And then we said, but there is no journal as far as we know. And then we discovered the Speech Communication Journal of AFA, American Forensic Association. And we thought, but what we have in mind is a little different. And it should be a theoretical journal about argumentation. So we developed a plan, and it was a rather general plan. And we did not know which publisher to approach. And then we approached Rydell. Rydell was at the time a very famous publishing house for philosophical publications. And it was housed in Dordrecht, that's in the Netherlands. So we were about to approach them about that, and then, or we just had approached them, and then they let us know that there were also other people developing a plan for a journal. And these people were Michel Maillère from Brussels and Christian Plantin from France. And in those days, Plantin was also in Brussels. And then the publishers said it would be good if the four of you could meet and develop a joint plan, because we can hardly start two journals of argumentation. And then when we discussed the plan with Michel Maillère and Christian Plantin, what came out of it was a little bit different from what Rob and I had in mind, and a little bit different from what they had in mind. So in the beginning, argumentation was not the kind of journal we had in mind. And where did it differ? The most important difference was that we wanted a journal where people, scholars, researchers could send their papers to in order to get them published. So submit papers to the journal. And what the others had in mind was a guest edited issues journal, where you would have each time a new issue guest edited by someone who was a specialist in a certain field or approach or whatever. And then over the year, you would have, let's say, 4 issues, that was the idea, devoted to a different theme. And we agreed to that because we thought it might be a good start, but that is not what we want in the end. Because in the end, we want to have a journal that would stimulate people to work on whatever they want to work on, and to have that reviewed and eventually published. But during the first years, it was a journal that published only guest edited issues on specific themes. And another thing was that the Belgians and French wanted to have not only English in the journal, but also French. And we said, Rob and I said, we do not think that that will work. It's okay with us, but it won't work. And soon enough, it proved that it did not work when we started doing this, because many Americans, for instance, said, but I cannot read that language. Why would I have a subscription to a journal where they publish papers that I cannot read? And that was indeed what we had expected. But another thing we had expected was that these people from different countries in those days would have such a different background that they would refer to quite different literature, that they would have different ideas about what argumentation should be, etc., and argumentation theory. So in the beginning, Rob and I thought it is interesting to have these issues on these themes, but it's not really what we have in mind. And then after several years, the publisher also saw that it did not fully work in this way. And I think that Michel Maillère and also Christian Plantin agreed that we should make certain changes. And then it changed from the journal as it originally was into a journal that had submissions and that would have a review procedure, and we created an editorial board of people who would look into these papers. And so it started until at a certain point, Michel Maillère and Christian Plantin fell out with each other. And that meant that we had a smaller number of people working on it. And at a certain point, Rob and I did not want to go on in this way. So we were about to withdraw. And then the publisher said, no, but you should not withdraw. You should continue. You have good ideas about what to do with this journal. So they asked us to stay on, and they advised Michel to go on with his own work and his own journals because he was in philosophy and things like that. And from then onwards, it was basically Rob and me. And then we thought, now we can also broaden the editorship to include people from other communities that we would like to include in this enterprise. And we invited someone like John Woods, because he was doing argumentation theory from the perspective of logic. And so in the beginning, and Eric Krabbe and people like that. And so it started in that way with a board and editors that were from various backgrounds. And then gradually something developed in the world that you could call argumentation theory, and you had different communities that remained and different approaches, but it became clearer what that journal should be. And I always thought, as long as I can fulfill a role in stimulating this and making it work, then I will stay on. And also, we want to combine the journal with a book series. And we had a book series that's called Argumentation Library that has now published 43 volumes already. And argumentation itself exists already, as I said, since '86. So it's all getting older and older. And it's at a certain point, we sometimes changed the editorship, but I stayed on all the time. Rob died, so that meant that he was no longer an editor. And nowadays I work with small editorial group. One of them is Scott Jacobs, for instance.
Yeah.
And Bart and I, in practice, meet every week and we do let's say, the editorial work. And then we have a board consisting of people from all over the world representing all kinds of approaches. And these people are our advisors, mainly concerning individual manuscripts that have been sent to us. And like other journals, we cannot always do it in that way. Sometimes we also invite others who have a certain kind of expertise or who we think would have a good judgment, constructive judgment concerning the manuscript concerned. And that's how it started. And one big change was that about 11 years ago, I had come to the conclusion that it would not be good to reject all kinds of papers that made interesting analyses of argumentative events, but that were not, let's say, innovative from the perspective of theory. we thought it's interesting that someone applies now a theory or a certain approach to, let's say, a medical context or a political context. And it's not always necessary that you have a new argumentation model or something like that. And then we discussed that with John Benjamin's publishing house, and they said, but why don't we start a journal then that is specifically devoted to that? And then we split, as it were, the material that we could get between material that has to do with argumentation theory, and material that has to do with argumentation in the sense of applied theory or empirical work, and that is the Journal of Argumentation in Context. Because we had also discovered from my work in strategic maneuvering that it matters a lot in which context people are arguing, and that it would be interesting also to connect argumentation with real life argumentative practices and with practitioners in these practices, that you took into account these contextual and institutional contextual factors. And that meant that from then on we had 2 journals, and the second journal is also prospering, it's going well. It is of course much younger, and it has a separate editorial board, different publishers, so they are all together separate from each other, but there is a certain connection because they both deal with argumentation.
So I want to circle back to something you started with that I thought was really interesting. So if I heard you right, one of the founding moves for you and why you started your own journal was you looked at AFA, which was the American argumentation context, and you thought that it wasn't quite right. And I wanted to know, what was it that you saw in the original AFA, or in what drew you to that journal? What did you see that drew you to want to start your own journal?
No, it's not that we did not like it, but we thought in the first place it was too American.
What does that mean?
It means that everything that was published had some kind of relationship with the United States. It was, to our mind, a little provincial. We thought it's America is big, so you can hardly call it provincial. But to give you an idea of how we thought about it, we thought a lot is happening in the world. Never was there any reference to literature that was not, or it should be Habermas or something like that. Apart from a certain fashionable author, there would never be references to the international literature. And we thought that is a little bit too limited. Another thing is that when they talked about politics, it was always presidential debates in the United States. And I won't say that it is not interesting. And for instance, if we had a bigger country, I would like to have such a journal for the Netherlands with the politics and all the things that are going on here. But what Rob and I had in mind then was something different. We wanted to unite people, in a certain sense of unite, from all over the world in this joint enterprise. And we thought it doesn't matter that they have different approaches and different backgrounds, but they should all be interested in reading this journal. And so there were certain things we were missing in the Journal of the American Forensic Association, although we liked the journal and we even published in it.
You have some really famous pieces. So I'm hearing that you had a more cosmopolitan vision that was then what was available.
I would not say cosmopolitan because that sounds so pretentious. You must remember we come from a very small country, and you can hardly have the same views of the world that you have when you come from a much bigger country. That's a continent in itself. So in the Netherlands, you are used to being aware of the fact that you're always surrounded by other countries where people are also doing things and they are often similar, and you look at what they are doing and you exchange things. And in school, we learned to some extent English and French and German and languages like that. So and that's a completely different context from when you grow up in the United States. So it's not so much that we were criticizing anything. We just thought this is not what we want to achieve.
So I mean, totally. I'm trying to get a sense of what each one had to offer, right? So you were trying to get a more global perspective, whereas whereas AFA was more narrow in its objects it was looking at, and that totally makes sense. So how do you envision this journal participating or adding into the broader interdisciplinary conversation?
We thought at the time that I discovered when I started traveling to North America, Canada, United States, and also in Europe, that you had various kinds of communities within, let's say, what I would now call the argumentation community, although that community did not yet exist. So in the beginning, we thought all these people who are in rhetoric, or all these people who are in logic, informal logic or formal logic, but being interested in argumentation, people in faculties of law, certain linguists who are interested in argumentation, they were often not aware of each other's work, or they looked down on each other's work, or thought that it would be of no use to them. And we thought, but they are not right. They should be aware of what others are doing, try to understand it, and they should write their own pieces in such a way that other people can understand it. And that went together with our idea of having conferences and organizing ISA and stuff like that. So it was all one big project. And we thought, when you think of the interdisciplinary aspect, I was trained as a linguist and later in logic, but I was mainly a linguist. And I thought other people who were originally people from law, they had also interesting insights, and they were no longer limited to the law field or something like that. And I could see that in rhetoric, although in the beginning we did not do much with that, but later we benefited also greatly from that. So that was originally the interdisciplinary idea, that we thought we should make sure that all these people from different kinds of worlds, so to speak, whether it's disciplinary or regional, that they should all take part in this. Later, when you had more of a community that came into existence, we could see that now you have certain ideas about argumentation and how to apply them, and you started applying them to different kind of institutional contexts. Then I thought it would be good to involve people who are really interested in politics and show them what you can do by studying argumentation in politics. And that you would draw the attention of people from the medical field, that we can say something about doctor-patient communication and doctor-patient argumentation. And that happened more in a journal like the Journal of Argumentation in Context. And that is exactly what we had in mind, to draw in all these contexts. And then the problem is that you do not want to have a journal that is only devoted to argumentation and religion, or only devoted to argumentation and medicine. Right. But you would still like to draw these people in who have that interest, and you would like them to explain what that means and to look for parallels and differences and things like that. So in that sense, I think that also in the applications, what we try to do is interdisciplinary. And argumentation is already by itself an interdisciplinary field. One of the reasons I told you that earlier, why I started doing argumentation, is that I got bored doing just linguistics. I thought it would be so nice if I could broaden things to such an extent that you also need insights from other disciplines. And I think when you study argumentation, you can hardly say what I'm doing is only psychology, or what I'm doing is only linguistics, or what I'm doing is only logic. So it is already basically interdisciplinary in itself.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So I was wondering, you talked about a couple different publishing houses. You talked about John Benjamin's, you talked about Springer. Could you talk a little bit about how those different publishing houses might influence a journal?
They have, of course, each different background, and sometimes before you start working with a publishing house, you consider, do they have anything to offer that is interesting for you or for your project, so that it is connected with other work they do? And yeah, in the case of Springer, we did not start with Springer. We started because these publishing houses also have their own lives, so to speak. We started with Rydell, and later there was some kind of takeover, and Rydell became part of Kluwer Academic. And our journal became also part of that. And that meant that the environment had changed considerably. In Kluwer, in Rydell, we were more or less in the company of philosophers. And philosophically minded people in the publishing house, the people who worked there, they knew about philosophy, and they were not so much aware of all kinds of other fields. When we went to Kluwer, there were also people who were interested in law and fields like that. And Rob and I liked that because we thought the broader, the better. And then Kluwer was taken over by Springer. And Springer was even more international, even bigger, and also broader as far as disciplines are concerned. And what we said from the beginning, we also would like to publish books. We would like to have a journal together with a book series. And that happens with Argumentation. It happened also later with the Journal of Argumentation in Context. And in the case of Argumentation, we thought this is a general journal that offers theory, and we should be aware of the fact that we are not the first people who study argumentation, so it would be good to have the historical dimension and pay attention to that, and have in our book series things that we cannot always publish in articles, but studies, monographs pertaining to classical argumentation theory or medieval things, and also books that were a little bit more substantial than what you can do in one article, but always theory related, the theory of argumentation. Whereas Benjamin's was much more practical in many respects. It was more linguistically, or I should rather say more language-oriented publishing house. John Benjamin's, when he came from the United States and he started the publishing house in Europe, he wanted to publish books in what we would generally call linguistics, but the kind of linguistics he preferred was in the beginning pragmatics and stuff like that, that was developing, so new things, but that were not very central to linguistics as it was at the time. You could say that Chomsky and the other authors, they were not published by Benjamin's. Benjamin's published all kinds of new things that had to do with language in use. And because we were interested for this journal in language in use, we thought this is the right publishing house for us, because that connects us with people who are interested in how language is used to convince people and persuade people. And in that sense, there was a good background in both cases. But also, when you look at Springer, we thought it should be a publishing house that also went for Kluwer, that has the power of reaching the whole world, so to speak. It's no use to have a publishing house that only reaches, let's say, Western Europe. We want a publishing house that is more ambitious and also more powerful in that respect. So also in that regard, Springer is a good publishing house. And then there are certain policies that they have, and that was the fact that they also publish books. There are publishing houses that concentrate on journals, and other publishing houses do not have journals, but only books. But we thought that combination is what we would like. That is, in fact, what we really want. And and they also had the expertise to help us. And they were a high quality publishing house. They had really good standards. That's also something I found important, because if you would like to make something of a discipline, then you have to aim high. You have to make something out of it that is really in accordance with standards that are high enough to make your discipline recognized as a real discipline. And by the time that we had reached the contextual stage with John Benjamin's, we did not lose these standards, but we thought we need other things to be incorporated in our publishing house. And I must say, in both cases, it also made a difference that the people we met with were enthusiastic and nice. So we and not so bureaucratic. That's also important.
That's nice. Yeah.
I hate that. Most people hate that somehow you are subjected to it more and more.
Yeah.
And yeah, people like the Benjamins people are friends of mine. There are people that are really interested in making a success of many of their projects, but also of the argumentation projects. And that's another reason why I think this is a good publishing house. And in both cases, they were also interested in certain basic ideas that Rob and I had, and later Bart and I, about stimulating people to publish. We are not, let's say, I'm not interested in publishing houses that only want to publish the best authors in the field in order to be a posh publishing house.
Yeah.
But I want a publishing house that is interested in making the field develop and encouraging young people to take part in it and make something of it, but all in accordance with high standards, of course. And
Yeah.
that drove me to these publishing houses, and that also made it stick.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was wondering if they had any analytics that encourage or guide any decision. Like you're seeing more and more of these days, like impact factor or alt metrics or anything like that they give you.
They certainly have that. Even before we met, I had a meeting with the person in charge of, in this case, argumentation from Springer. And we discussed all these factors. And we went through a report about last year and how we did in that year. And certain things that she wondered, why is that the case? And other things that we said, but why is that important? And I must say, I'm not a great believer in, let's say, policies of editors that are based on these metrics. But I think you should be aware of them, because it's very good to know which are the articles that are downloaded most, which are the articles that are quoted most, which are the countries that where people read these articles, in which universities. So all these data can be very illuminating. It's not that I then think, oh, let's now go on and only invite people from Mexico or whatever. I develop, as it were, my own ideas, but it's in order to make them broader and also to make it possible to involve more people in it. You are interested in seeing what happens when you see that certain articles are downloaded in all kinds of countries that you would never expect, and that people read that. You do not know what they think of it, except for the fact that there's a certain popularity of certain articles or certain themes. And then that may make it possible to involve more of these people in the future, because I have always broadened the interest in argumentation from, let's say, Western Europe and the United States and Canada to Latin America and to Asia, China, Japan, Indonesia. Of course, meanwhile, also people in Australia, South Africa, New Zealand were taking part in it. But I want to make it as broad as possible and involve also people from Egypt and also people from North Africa, like Morocco and states like that. And then it's good to know what the facts are, what they read, what they download. It's also good to see where the emphasis is in what you get as far as submissions are concerned, and also to see how many get rejected and what kind of, where do they come from, all these rejected papers, and the papers that get published. So it's more that it is, to me, these are data that I like to be aware of And they connect very well with my traveling and trying to develop interest in all these countries in argumentation theory, because I think it is not something that should only develop in Amsterdam or something like that. No, I'm interested in all these people that often from cultures that are very different from mine seem to be interested in this topic, and we discuss it, and in the end I also want to have them publish in our journals.
So
I just want to say that is not always successful yet, but I can see it goes in stages.
Yeah, do you mind sharing where you're seeing the most growth right now in argumentation?
Sorry?
Where do you see the most growth right now, or interest?
The most growth, I would say, at this point in time, there's a growing interest in China already for a lot of years, and that is something that I like, because I think it's necessary that people are interested in reasonableness and rationality and how to convince each other by speaking to each other and trying to give reasons for what we think is necessary to do. So I'm happy also that people from a country that is so different, with an ideology that is much different from the ideology in the Netherlands or United States, that they are all the same interested in these same kind of phenomena and how they work. But China is, let's say, an excellent example of growing interest. And sometimes on a smaller scale, you can see it also depends on where are good people. And then it's more local. I discovered at a certain point that in Switzerland, for instance, in Lugano, there were some people working, it proved to be a very small group, but that attracted people and that taught people stuff. And these people, they go back to where they came from or to other places. We tried to do something similar in Amsterdam, and now you have, for instance, in Lisbon, a group of people, young people who are working on argumentation. These are just examples that I'm aware of. And I think that it would be good to do all we can, not only to stimulate that males and females participate, but also people from all over the world. And I always regret that, for instance, from Africa, we get a lot of requests for papers and things like that, but we do not often have stuff that is sent to us for review that makes it to being published. But that'll come.
Excellent.
That'll come.
So circling back, you were referred to the editorial boards earlier, and you have a couple different ones. Can you tell us a little bit about how you select your editorial board and what exactly they do?
How we select them, that has to do with what they are supposed to do. We want to have constructive people who understand that they are not the jurors or something like that, but that they need to stimulate people to make the best of their paper, and also tell them honestly that nothing good can be made of it in the worst case. And people who really have a fair but also constructive judgment, but based on what we would say experience and knowledge of the discipline. And we want to have people who have proven themselves by writing stuff that they can do that kind of job themselves. And then we want it to be a little bit representative, not really that we count, but we do not want to have only pragmadialecticians. No, not at all. We want to have people from all kinds of, let's say, backgrounds when it comes to approaches, all kinds of interests, people who are interested in the fallacies, people who are interested in empirical work, etc. And then we want, if it's possible, to have also some kind of geographical division. Let's say not only Americans or only Dutchmen, but a mixed group, mixed crowd. And we want also more experienced people. We never chose people because at the very beginning we may have done that in '86. These are well-known people, but that's later, that was never an issue. The issue was more do you know this guy or this lady? And is that someone who can contribute something in the sense I just indicated? And then, if that seems to be the case, then we say invite her or invite him. And yeah, sometimes you also have to change that group. We never change the whole group because you need to remain consistent in a certain sense. But when we see that it's always the same people giving the advice, then we think it would be good to look for new people. That's not always so simple because you only get to know them when they have already developed a little bit further into their career. And they need also some experience, otherwise they cannot be good reviewers. But that's something you are always on the lookout for, to find people who can fulfill that role. So that's the way we select. And then we draw up a list. Now we have a list and we say that this or that person has been there already for, let's say, 8 years. And it might be good because we do not have so many papers anymore on topics that are close to that person. Perhaps we can find someone for another topic that we can see that is now has become important, or we think we do not have enough people that have a good eye for methodology and empirical work and things like that. So let's look for people who can fill that gap. And then we draw up a list. And then let's assume that it's only men or only women. That never happens. But then you would say that is not, let's say, a good balance. Or that's the same as the geographical thing, that we never vote for someone because he's an American, but we think that's a good scholar and we should have a certain variety in where they come from. And then we expect them to be willing to do that work in a constructive way and not in an authoritarian way, but in a strict way, in the sense that they should not ignore certain standards and they should maintain these standards, but they should explain that, if possible, to the author in a way that is constructive, so that the author understands, oh yeah, this is not what I did. And they should also understand that in the end, they do not take the decision, they advise the reviewers. And that in fact goes also for us, the editors, that in the end you have to take a decision. But that goes in so many stages. And you can see also that people often disagree. It happens very often that, that we invite, let's say, 2 reviewers to start with, and that one says minor revisions and the other one says reject. And that sounds like it is crazy. And when you tell such a thing to outsiders, they always say, how can that be? But I understand how that can be, and you understand that too. And
absolutely.
I think that then we always go for the most, let's say, the possibility that offers most prospects for a continuation. Let's say when we have major revisions and reject, then we would go for major revisions in most cases, unless we read in the judgment of the one who says reject, we see good reasons why this paper cannot be remedied, because there's something wrong with the data or whatever. In empirical work, it also depends on the kind of paper it is. But in general, we would be inclined to give people a chance to do it again. And on the other hand, when one says minor revisions and the other said major revisions, then I'm inclined to go for the major revisions, because then I think rework it, think carefully about it, because it's very important that there is serious consideration among the authors of the objections and the remarks of the reviewers, that they do not just ignore certain things. They do not always have to agree, you understand. And there are certain things that you think, yeah, that you can have the opinion that your reviewer has not understood what you were aiming for. But then you have to realize that it's you who has to make that clear what you're aiming for. And then you cannot always follow the direction that he indicates, but you have to explain that you're going to try to do that better because you still want to make this point and not the point that he or she wants you to make. Am I clear enough?
Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense. So can I repeat back sort of what I'm hearing to you? Is that one of the things that you're saying, and we're talking about when you're on the editorial board, you're selecting them to be reviewers. And when you get feedback for them on an essay, they can go a couple different ways. They could tell you to reject, to accept, minor revisions, major revisions. And because you're sending to a couple of them, they can give you a variety of opinions. Yeah. And one of the things I'm hearing you say is that you're often going to give the most charitable and favorable read that enables the manuscript to go forward, unless there are some significant red flags. That is a major issue with it. But you're also going to give the read that enables the manuscript to be the most robust. So if you have a minor revision and a major revision, you're still going to be more inclined towards the major revision because there's clearly something going on, or there's something that might need
I wish I had said it in this way, because you express it very well. That's exactly what I had in mind. Yeah, yeah. That's the way we go about in dealing with these matters. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense, right? Because this is one of the major issues I think people are thinking about when they confront with all these letters, like, how do you do it? Now, what advice do you have for people? Because if you're on the writer side, you get all this feedback and now you have to write a letter. What advice do you have for authors in penning their response for resubmission?
Oh, in making their response, yeah. But I would say, even before that, I would say, make always sure that you read the literature. That is a striking thing in the, let's say, the papers that are sent to our journals, that unlike in what I hear from fields like chemistry and other fields, that some people do not seem to be aware of the fact that they are not the first people who study a certain topic, but that others have done that too. And that is not only your own teacher who did that, but that there may be people in other parts of the world. And nowadays it's so easy to get to know who published about a certain subject, because we have all these computerized helps. So the first thing is that I would say, make sure that you know about literature, and that what you do is embedded in it, in the sense that it connects with what people who do argumentation, your readers, what they are interested in, so that you connect it with a certain approach or a certain study of a certain topic, or you say, I'm not starting at the very beginning, but I assume that this and that is the case, and now the problem is this and that is what I am going to concentrate on. Another thing is, make sure that you delineate your problem clearly, so that it is very clear what the problem is that you would like to solve. But because very often you think, yeah, it's an essay and it contains all kinds of things, but what is it that he or she is aiming to achieve here? That is another thing I find important. And then the third thing is, make it accessible to the readers. And the readers are not a general public in the case of our academic journals. So it's not a problem when you use certain jargon when it is necessary. If it's really clear what is meant by these terms and things like that, and they are familiar to your kind of readers, and then I would say it's still necessary to write it down in such a way that other people can repeat what the quintessential elements are of your expose. And sometimes when I read certain things, I think, yeah, but I cannot repeat this. I cannot explain to others what it is that someone was doing. And then you need to know what it is that you want to say. What is your point? And you may have a problem that is nice, and you may connect your problem to the literature, and you may explain things in such a way that is clear what you are concentrating on and what you mean by what you say. But then you also need to have some kind of, I would not call it a solution, but something that goes into the direction of a solution. How what is it that makes your article worthwhile publishing? Why is it that you publish this? You have an idea. What is that idea? And how can you express that so clearly that others can say, oh yeah, that is an interesting idea. Yeah, these are some main points. And then another point more of a different nature is that when you hand it in to an academic journal, make sure that you have done all the things that you need to do, like make it possible for people to do blind refereeing, leave out all the things that make it in fact clear that it's you who wrote it. I know that that's not always possible, because especially not when you are an established author, then people will see quite clearly and quite soon who you are. So that's more an advice for younger people in general who start out. And I think it is also necessary to make sure that you have no typos and no other things, ungrammatical sentences and things like that. Problem is that for many people, I'm one of them, English is not their native language. So they have to learn how to do that. And they leave out articles where people who are native speakers would put an article, or they do something else that is odd. So that is why I would say, when you're not a native speaker, make someone read your paper, someone who is a native speaker and someone who takes that job seriously, in the sense that he really wants to help you, and send it in only then, because I know that a lot of papers get rejected because the reviewers get annoyed when they start reading it. They sometimes write me also a letter and they say, oh, I found it so annoying when I saw all these typos, or when I saw how poor the English was, or when I saw that he had nothing to say but just started babbling or whatever. So all the things I just mentioned are said because I know that you will have a better chance of getting published when you make sure that you fulfill these points. And even then, but then it becomes more interesting, because then these constructive comments can come in. Then people may understand what you said and say, yeah, I understand what you're heading at, but why don't you do this? Or did you not forget that? And then you can answer that later, then you get further.
That
I hope
totally
I'm
makes
clear.
sense. Yeah, you're very clear on that. So I was wondering if you can tell me, let's say we prepare our manuscript for submission. Tell me about a week in the life of a journal editor. Is there, and this relates to a follow-up question I want to sneak in there that was asked by popular demand, I should say, when I was polling questions. Does this have a seasonality to it in which there might be a strategic advantage?
Yeah, that's disappointing, but not really, I would say. Only in the sense that when it's summer, you have more time to think about matters. Then I always think about special issues and other things that I can invite people for. But during a normal week, it depends on that particular week. When I have proofs to correct, I'm busy with that. When I don't have proofs to correct, I may have more time to ponder about certain things that have to do with the journals. But basically, it's always the same. That, let's say that Bart and I meet on a Wednesday, like we did today. Then on, let's say, Monday and Tuesday, because I know that that meeting is coming up, I look at what we have and what kind of things, and I always make notes in my agenda. So everything I have to remember is in there. So also with PhD students, when I think he should read this or she should do that, and I write it down, and that also goes for this. So I have a whole list of notes, and then I order that a little bit before we have the meeting. And then Bart and I spend always one afternoon or one full morning, let's say 4 hours, on journal editing every week. And we always do that, even when we think, oh, there might be not so much, because then we can spend time on thinking about what we should stimulate or who we should write for a special issue or things like that. And then usually after we have had this meeting, we have dealt with several things on the spot, but there are always things left where I said, oh, but I can write a letter to him to ask more about that, or I can request that to this person, and you do that, let's say, on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, something like that. That is the week schedule, and it's always the same. It varies because sometimes Bart is away for a few days, and then I do more, and sometimes I'm away, and then Bart does more. But that is not, let's say, something that can be helpful to authors.
Yeah. Now, one of the
And
things
yeah, I just wanted to say you're always an editor of a journal, so I expect that it would be the same with a journalist. So you always, even when I read other journals or the newspaper, then I sometimes think, strange that no one writes about this, or this is something we could also do, or we should pay more attention to this or that. It's something that's always on your mind. Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, something I think about, one of the things I'm taking away from this interview is you're a master of managing your time. The capacity for you to govern, to edit all of these journals while writing is very impressive, and it takes such strict time management. So what has being an editor taught you about making an argument in the academic context?
Yeah, I do not think that it is so different from making an argument in other spheres of life. The only thing is that I had expected when I entered academia that people would be better capable of making arguments. That also goes for me myself. I remember when I wrote my doctoral dissertation, and even before that I had to learn. I always had opinions about everything in those days.
Yeah.
I have a little bit fewer opinions now than I used to have. But when if someone had asked me, write down why that is the right opinion, or why we should do that, or whatever, then it becomes harder. And I really had to learn how to write a paper and how to write a book, and that's also when I'm supervising theses or dissertations, then I think that is my main task, by explaining things, by ridiculing things in a somewhat friendly way and say, yeah, how can that be, and things like that. Then I hope that I can stimulate them to develop some kind of pleasure in creating the best possible text and the best possible arguments. And I must say that I have learned, but that may be that it's an illusion, but I don't think so, that by studying argumentation, you can indeed become a better arguer yourself. But it's not an automatic thing. It is something you still have to learn while working on it. And I fear that it goes on forever. The learning process, I mean.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've never been so impressed by, let's say, the way academics write or reason. In some cases, I was impressed by the way one particular individual wrote or reasons. And when I look at the journals, I cannot say that people now write much better than they did 30 years ago or 40 years ago, because they all have to develop their skills and have to develop their powers of persuasion and things like that. So yeah, that's the only thing I can say about it.
Well, I think that's a good segue to one question. I know we're running short on time. I wanted to ask you because I feel like you're in a unique position, being in before we started recording, I was joking that you've been in charge of the journal almost as long as I've been alive. And I wanted to ask, what have you noticed or seen or evolve on this question of what is an argument or argumentation over this period of time and change? I just sort of want to know if you have some meta comment about that.
About how my idea of the concept of argument or argumentation changed.
Or what you've seen.
Yeah, what I first of all discovered is that I was originally very limited to, let's say, the Dutch context. So you have in Dutch a word argumentatie, an argument, And they have a different meaning from these words in English. Not in every respect different, but for instance, argumentation is automatically connected with reasonableness in Dutch and not with fighting or quarreling. The idea of an argument, like you used that in English, as a quarrel, that does not exist. So in the beginning, I was amazed that people made such a fuss about what that word meant and how you would use that. And in that sense, I learned a lot from the fact that people speak different languages and that they often use their terminology, and many people keep using it in harmony with the way these words are used in their own language. And that is something I can imagine. And that is also wise to some extent, because otherwise the people of that language community would find it strange how you use these words. On the other hand, it would be good to realize that when you speak about a concept, the concept of argument, the concept of argumentation, that you should also be able to abstract from that and see the various kind of elements or factors that play a part in it. And I think that in the beginning, I was more convinced that you could find solutions by having all kinds of formal means of theorizing. And when you consider yourself an analytic philosopher, as I did in those days, not a philosopher, but someone interested in analytic philosophy, then it often goes together with a certain belief in formalism and things like that. I never really believed that, but I did not realize that. I believed more in creating clarity. So, and that is something that I now see also as the main task of analytic philosophy. That's creating clarity about how we speak to each other and how we try to get to an understanding with each other. And that same thing I also applied to the word arguments and argumentation and the concept of argument and argumentation behind that. And then I discovered that you can, in ways that I had not imagined, say things that are clarifying about argumentation that are only from a certain perspective, that you can, let's say, approach such a concept from a psychological perspective, and that you can say, this is what argumentation amounts to. In the past, I might have said, no, it's not what argumentation amounts to. Now I would say, yeah, but is it not strange that you then say this or that? And then that person might say, yeah, that is in fact not relevant to what I'm saying, because people are seldom, it also goes for me, very pure in how they see things in an abstract way. But I see now better than I saw in the beginning that it can be enlightening to look at such concepts from all kinds of perspectives and try to make clear what kind of understanding that provides. And that is new. I was not only more inclined to believe in formal solutions, but I was always also more inclined to think that one solution would be the only solution or the best solution.
Yeah.
And I do not want to say anything goes, but I want to say there are more possibilities of creating clarity and illuminating things. And that is what I learned also from the editorial work, because you see so many different kinds of interests and approaches and let's say academic backgrounds that are brought to bear. Yeah, it's in that sense a fascinating kind of job.
It's so cool. You get to read so much interesting stuff and perspectives and so many heuristics.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so neat.
Yeah, but you also read a lot of nonsense.
Oh yeah, well, I mean that's
also the case that you need to remain critical and say, but what does that mean? And why do you say it like this? And things like that. So it's both.
Yeah, you got to sift through it, right? But you get some gems.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, anything else you think we should know?
I don't think so. It was nice to talk to you about this, and you're always welcome to ask questions to me, and I'll try to give answers. And I hope
No,
that
this
they are
was
clear.
very clear. This was wonderful, and we really, really appreciate your time. I already see we're over it, and I just want to thank you again. We'll post this up, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. You're most welcome, and let me know where it's posted, when it's posted, so that I can see it. Thanks very much.
Absolutely.